All right, in this lecture, we are going to look at the structure of bone. Let me pull up my PowerPoint slides. All right. So before we talk about the structure of bone, I do want to just quickly talk about the functions of the skeleton. So the most obvious of these is going to be support, right? Obviously, our skeleton is going to help to support our body weight, to keep us upright, and support all of the other components of our body. It also provides protection, right? So our skull is going to protect our brain. Our ribs are going to protect the organs in our thorax. And it's also going to be crucial for allowing us to move, right? Articulations, also known as joints, are going to be where you have connections between bones of the skeleton and where you can have movement between bones of the skeleton. And the skeleton is also going to provide attachment points for muscles and tendons, which creates leverage for those so that they can move our body. The skeleton is also an important storage area. So it stores lots of minerals and fats. And for the minerals that it stores, many of these are ions that our body uses. So for example, calcium ions. And we'll talk about this in more detail, but essentially you can think of the skeleton as like a storage reserve for calcium in our body. And so it can store calcium and then it can release calcium as we need it. And then finally, the skeleton is also going to function in the production of blood cells because the production of blood cells occurs in our bone marrow. So let's take now a look at the structure of bones, what actually makes bones, so we can sort of connect that back to function. So what is bone? Bone is a supporting connective tissue, which is also called osseous tissue. So you should recognize this term, right? Connective tissue. We've talked about other types of connective tissue so far in the course. And connective tissue, by definition, is a tissue that is made up of two components, specialized cells, and then a matrix, which is the substance that surrounds those cells. And so as a reminder, these are our sort of various categories of connective tissues. And we notice that if we look at supporting connective tissues, all right, we have both bone and cartilage. We'll talk about cartilage a little bit at the end of these slides, but bone, right, is going to have a solid matrix, okay? So that's going to differentiate it from other types of connective tissue that we've looked at so far in this course, such as loose connective tissue or dense connective tissue, which have a gel-like matrix. Bone has a solid matrix. So what makes the matrix of bone? Here in this image, we can see we're looking at bone, a little slice of bone down at the cellular level. And so we can see these dark blobs here are actually the living cells of bone called osteocytes. And we'll talk more about those in a moment. But all of this substance in between the cells, all of the substance that surrounds them is the matrix. And so the matrix, we can also call it the extracellular matrix, meaning outside of the cells, contains two components. Component one is fibers, okay? And specifically in bone, these are collagen fibers. Remember, collagen is made up of protein, right? So it's protein collagen fibers. And these fibers give bones a little bit of flexibility. We don't think of our bones as being very flexible, but they actually, in a living person, your bones can bend just a little bit. Not a lot, obviously, but a little bit of flexibility actually is very important to keep our bones from being too brittle. If our bones were really brittle, they would shatter easily. And so to prevent that, we need to have a little bit of flexibility, and that comes from the collagen fibers in the matrix. The rest of the matrix is made up of the ground substance. And this is a part of it that is inorganic and that is solid. So what this is composed of are crystallized mineral salts. And specifically, you have calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate, which together create hydroxyapatite crystals. You guys don't need to worry about the specific structure of hydroxyapatite crystals. But important thing that you'll notice is that calcium is a big component, right? So our bones contain a lot of calcium, and that is going to wind up being really important in their function. And again, this ground substance, right, it's solid and it's also mineralized. So bones are hard and brittle. And that's the part of it that makes it hard and brittle. But again, not too brittle, because the collagen helps balance that out a little bit and give bones a little bit of flexibility. So we tend to think of bones as these sort of static structures, but they are in fact not static at all. Bone is living tissue, just like all the rest of the tissue in our body. And what actually happens is the matrix of bone is continually recycled and renewed through a process called remodeling. And what remodeling means is it's a sort of a continual breakdown and rebuilding of our bones. We're continually destroying parts of our bones and rebuilding them. So we're continually renewing our bone tissue. And so remodeling is sort of a balance between bone resorption, which is just a name for the destruction of bone, and bone growth. And all of our bones are continuously at all times undergoing remodeling. But the rate of remodeling is going to vary. So what it's going to depend on is the kind of activities that we're doing, which is to say, what are the kinds of forces that we're applying to our bones? Our bones actually react to anything that applies force to them. So primarily this is going to be weight-bearing exercise. So walking or weightlifting, for example, is going to help build bone mass. You're going to have a higher amount of remodeling, and that remodeling, you're going to usually have bone growth that outpaces bone resorption to some extent. And that's how you can build bone mass. On the other side of the equation, though, you can also lose bone mass if you're not subjecting your bone to normal forces. So for example, if you are someone who is in a wheelchair for a while, you can wind up losing bone mass in your leg bones because you're not subjecting them to normal sort of weight-bearing forces. So in that case, resorption would outpace bone growth in remodeling. So bone is continuously, again, being broken down and rebuilt. And there is a group of cells that are responsible for this. So we'll start by looking at the cells that produce matrix. And the first group of cells that we're going to look at are called osteoprogenitor cells, which we can see in this image here. They're these little flat cells. These are stem cells. So they're constantly dividing. And as they divide, they are going to produce this next type of cell, which we see here, which is called an osteoblast. Note that osteo means bone. So anytime you see osteo, that's referring to bone. The osteoprogenitor cells are found in the periosteum and endosteum. So those are stem cells that are dividing. They're going to create osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are immature bone cells, and they're also going to be the builders of bone. So they secrete the organic components of bone matrix. So they're going to be responsible for bone growth, for creating new bone. Some of the osteoblasts will fully mature and become osteocytes, which we can see here. Osteocytes are our mature bone cells, and their job is to maintain the surrounding matrix. So osteoblasts, and we'll talk about this more later, but osteoblasts are mobile cells. So they can move around, and they sort of move around through the matrix, and they're creating more matrix around them as they move. Eventually, sometimes they'll get sort of stuck in a little pocket of matrix, and within that little pocket, that's when they will start to mature and turn into an osteocyte. So osteocytes are not mobile cells. They stay in their little pocket in bone and don't move. But they just help to sort of maintain the matrix that surrounds them. They also can sense when stress or strain is applied to that matrix. And so they're going to react when you are doing those weight-bearing exercises we talked about. They're going to register that and communicate with other bone cells and with each other to help regulate bone growth and resorption. So they're sort of controlling the process of remodeling, and they're sort of maintaining the matrix that surrounds them. And then our last category of bone cell are the destructive bone cells, and these are osteoclasts. And these are actually quite different from the other bone cells that we've looked at. They are not derived from osteoprogenitor cells. They're actually derived from the stem cells that make white blood cells. And they are similar to white blood cells in some ways. They are very large, they're multinucleate, so they're big cells with multiple nuclei, and they are going to secrete a mix of acids and enzymes that destroy the matrix around them. So they are responsible for bone resorption, bone destruction. And so you can see here in this image, here's an osteoclast, and here it is, it's been sort of moving around, right? They're mobile. And as it moves around, it's destroying all of the matrix around it. It's basically sort of eating away at that matrix. Okay, so during remodeling, osteoclasts will come in and remove bone, and then osteoblasts will come in behind them and rebuild the bone, and then some of those osteoblasts that are left in place are going to turn into osteocytes. And just for a quick sort of comparison here, we will be talking a little bit about cartilage as well. Cartilage, especially when we talk about the growth of bone and joints, which contain cartilage. So cartilage is the other type of supporting connective tissue. It also has a solid matrix, and we'll see that it has some similarities and some differences from bone. So it contains cells, but its cells are called chondrocytes. Okay, chondro meaning cartilage, cyte meaning cell, so cartilage cells. And the cartilage cells are going to help sort of build the matrix of cartilage, which again is going to consist of two things. One is fibers, and these are also collagen, okay, but it has a lot more collagen in it than bone does, which is what makes cartilage more flexible than bone. And then third, the ground substance. And we don't need to worry about the exact components of ground substance for cartilage, but simply know that it's solid, but it's not mineralized. So it has actually kind of a rubbery texture rather than a hard, brittle texture. So this makes it quite a different sort of texture from bone. All right, and so that is it for the structure of bone.